You are listening to the Fresh Take Network.
What it is, what it do. Welcome to Fresh Take. Joshua Adam Liam Arbuthnot. I am very pleased to have today's guest, Moses Woldu. Moses, welcome to the pod.
Glad to be on. Thank you.
So, it's you're one of the more prominent factors and faces in Calgary sports, and it's been awesome to see your face on Global News. But let's take it all the way back before we kind of get to that, and I'm sure we're gonna have some fantastic stories on your side. But the first question that I always like to ask is, when did you know you wanted to do this crazy thing called broadcasting?
All right, Josh. Well, I think we'll have to set the scene. I had hair back then. Let's just put it
Okay,
that way.
very nice.
Less hair on the face, more on the head. But yeah, it came down to me because I originally was in poli-sci at the University of Saskatchewan. So I grew up in
Okay.
Saskatoon. That's where I was raised. I was born in Yorkton from immigrant parents who came in '84. Shortly had me later, a couple months later, and the rest is history. So I've been a prairie kid all my life. But it was around the time when I was in my first year university, and I'm much like a lot of students out there. I procrastinate. I could talk the talk, but doing the assignments, I'm just like, I'd rather go party or do something else. So I needed
Yeah.
something that, for me in particular, something that was very stimulating, and of course, news was part of that. Growing up at a very young age, we were taught about news, so I would watch, CBC National. I watched CTV, whatever I could, global, or Can West at the time, just to kind of figure out what's going on in the world. So and this was something that I've always done for like years when I was younger. Like he may have not done his assignment, but yet he does know what's going on in Rwanda or what's happening with the issues in terms of like tainted blood, or the scandal that happened in the late '80s, early '90s, something like that. So it puzzled a lot of teachers when I was younger, but they're like, he knows what's going on globally for a young man, but he's not doing the work. What's going on. But I
Yeah.
needed something that always would stimulate me. So news was one of those things I got interested at a very young age, and kind of ties into where I am today. And I eventually got into broadcasting. Went to Lethbridge College. It was through a friend of mine that recommended me to go to the school. She had a sister that worked at a radio station. Told me about Lethbridge. It was the furthest thing from my mind, but I was like, you know what? Let's give it a shot. So it was one of those things where last minute in the summer, I applied, I got accepted, and that's where the journey began. So about 2005, if I'm dating myself, so I'm pretty sure some of the kids are going to be listening to this, or people listening to this may have not been born then. So 2005 was an interesting time, but
Yes.
no, hey, it was good basketball too. I'll tell you that much.
It
Uh,
really was.
yeah, absolutely. So going into that, it was around that time when I went to Lethbridge College. I for the first time, even though I liked, learning about politics and learning about sports, and I was a big sports kid growing up, uh, it felt like it was the right thing for me. So I fell right in line, and my first and foremost, my goal was sports. I loved it. I wanted to do it. Growing up in Saskatchewan, you played a lot of sports. You ended up, watching a lot. You watched if it's football, hockey, or basketball, or whatever it was, right? You did a lot. And so for me, I just kind of gravitated to that. And that was my primary focus. So I was like, you know what, sports or bust. And it was through school where I learned, and I kind of thought to myself, okay, you know what, maybe it's not just sports, but other things down the line that will help me out. And it's kept me in this industry. I'll tell you that much. In terms of learning how to shoot, learning how to edit, learning how to report, learning how to, ask the proper questions, doing all the things that you need to. And it's very interesting. And I know with you, you've been through the program, and you're following what you do and you love. That's great. But I'm sure there are other elements while you were at school. So if you wanted to, let's say, focus on news, but you had to do a sports story, or vice versa,
Yeah.
there are certain elements that come into play in either direction that will translate and make you a much better reporter or an anchor, whether it be
Yep.
in sports or in news. So I was very fortunate where I was able to kind of adapt, in this industry, the ebbs and flows. Ended up being a shooter. I was very fortunate after my 2 years in Lethbridge to get a job right away with CTV there, and worked through the summer. Got a gig. They kept me on. They liked me so much. That's the good news. And there's another story behind that, and why I say it's always good to um, leave a leave on a positive note wherever you go. But in this case, yeah, it was very good. I was very fortunate to land a job out in Grand Prairie for a couple months. I was handing out demos like crazy. Like you would, you're just kind of slinging it like back in the day when they used to sling CDs and stuff out of
Yeah.
trunk of a car. I was doing that for every news director possible for every small town uh, in Western Canada. Essentially, I was very fortunate to catch the eye of someone in Red Deer. Worked there for 6 months. Unfortunately, through just kind of the changes in how media was going through around that time. So it would have been 2008 that we saw a lot of cutbacks, and it was very sad to see, because there was a lot of great people who even I followed, and I'm sure those listening would be familiar with, like the Darren Detitions, the Jay Onrights, those who have been out in there. Um,
Yeah.
the Roger Millions, who was a former broadcaster as well. You look at, there's a lot of names out there that are prominent within sports, as on television, that went through these steps and went through some of these towns. Those don't exist anymore. There's still some, um, fortunately enough. But I was very blessed to get that opportunity in Red Deer. Eventually, I went back to Saskatoon, worked part time as a shooter. So I was behind the scenes working the camera, getting adjusted to that for a couple years. Got my first big break in 2011, getting a job as a sports director out in Lloydminster for what was called New Cap Television. So I was working there for, oh gosh, it seems like eons. It was quite a long time, just given how our industry was going. So about a little over 4 years, I was very fortunate to go back home, but this time as a sports reporter and anchor in CTV in Saskatoon. Did that for about 2 years. There was a transition period around this time, funny enough, that they kind of went away from news, or sports, that is. So they go into the news element. And that's crazy enough. So you're transitioning from a job where I'm like, hey, I get to be part of a group. I remember watching some of the people when I was a kid on CTV, or Global, that had sports line. They used to have like these half-hour sports shows, and I'm sure you're very familiar with
Oh yeah.
how big those were, right? Channel 27, they were killing it after
Yep.
the 11:30 time slot, or whatever
100%.
it may
Yeah.
be, right? You know how it
Yeah.
goes.
Yeah.
Yo,
Yeah.
so that they kind of yeah, so that kind of winded down, right? So they kind of were centralizing and focusing on more sort of the news point. And it was then, and I did a little bit of news here and there, but it was really there in Saskatoon that, I really found an appreciation. I got to do a bit of anchoring for the news when I needed to fill in, and did weather. So I got real good hands-on experience. And there was one anchor that I worked with, and I believe it was one of her teachers, or there's someone along her line that, she found this great quote from, or she took a great quote from. And it's like taking and I'm going to butcher it, so I'm going to paraphrase it instead. It's basically taking someone that's in news and putting them into sports, and writing like teases and kind of those leads, and vice versa, having somebody in sports write in the news. You have a greater appreciation, and you all of a sudden open up your brain. And I think there's a lot of great people that I work with currently at Global here in Calgary that are fantastic when it comes to writing teases. So for me, like to learn and see how they do things. And I'm like, oh, can I incorporate that in my story? So when I'm doing sports, sometimes we'll write teases into a sports segment for their news anchors. So I kind of look at what they do, and I'm like, oh, that's a good way of like writing. I like how they did that. And my time in Saskatoon helped me build that, where you're able to kind of draw people, not saying, hey, game is here. Team A was taking on Team C or Team B, and here are the results after that. I'm like, no, you got to entice the person to come back on, right? And by
Yeah.
then, especially when it comes to pro sports, that's a bigger challenge, because they already know the score. So what are you telling me that they don't know from their phone, or from highlights that they watched that was on the bigger markets like your TSNs or Sportsnets? So what
Yeah.
am I going to provide them? So that's another challenge, and it makes it a very good one. So I'm learning how to kind of keep people in. So we're like, okay, we already know the score, but hey, hear more, hear what they have to reaction, what was going on, like so provide like nuggets for the audience and the viewers, and try to get them saying, okay, we'll stick around. Something that's not necessarily provided or you'll hear from the other networks. And the best part is, and I know in your line of work as well, how big local sports is. Man,
Yeah.
there's no bigger fan, I will say this, than myself when it comes to local sports. Like I love going to high school and watching, athletics at this young age because they love the sport. They
Yep.
love playing the game. They're not in for money. They don't make a paycheck. Heck, man, some of these guys, sometimes it's a nice distraction to get away from, their problems, whatever it may be, whether it be school or home, whatever it is. They come out there and they give it their all. That's so much fun to watch. And same thing with the university sports. These kids, want to make it to the next level if they can professionally, whether it be in basketball, hockey, football, you name it. And so they give it all they got, knowing that they want to get to that next stage. And it's really cool and fun to watch. So seeing the Dinos, seeing the Trojans, seeing the Cougars, getting that, St. Mary's when we can, out there, it's kind of tough, especially how everything's being consolidated in our industry. But whenever we can, we talk about lacrosse, getting on to that. So I'm getting a little excited over here. I don't know if you got another question for me, but
Oh
basically
yeah,
kind of
I love
summing
it.
up where I've been and I was very blessed, just kind of tying it up from Saskatoon, learning those skills in 2018. I was very fortunate to, kind of hand my resume and demo out to the people out here in Calgary, and they liked what I did, and it worked out beautifully. And now I've been here for, gosh, man, 3 years. Time's almost 3 years, so time is really flying by. But it's been a blast, and hopefully once COVID goes, but at least it's manageable where we can get to a normal that we can, see high school sports again, university sports again, fans in the seats, those things. So I'm excited for what the future is going to hold. But overall, it's been a great time, and that's kind of if that's the Cliff Notes version of my career.
I love it. Lots of things to go off on there.
Oh yeah,
You
for
were
sure.
you were talking about the local side, and I'm hoping that's something that gets a little bit more covered as we go forward in the next few years. They even get like a local live coverage of I can't talk, a Crow Child Classic, or like a Trojans game, just to kind of get. I mean, there is back in the day there was a big high school tournament between Churchill and Western, and it was one of the best games I've ever seen. It was the final for the women's, and that aired on. I think it was on Shaw at that time. We don't have that kind of, and so did some of the old state games that used to air in Shaw. And it's unfortunate we don't have those channels to showcase those games anymore, especially like a Crow Child Classic. I think back in the day, if I'm not mistaken, maybe Global was airing some of them. I could be wrong, but it'd be so nice to get those to showcase at least some of the U sports, to get it out there, because there's so many great games every single week happening at the U sport and the ACAC level out here. And the Calvary, they've had a nice little rise going on. The Inferno had a nice little rise.
Sure.
So like you said, that for you coming here, that local sport market, getting to have it when you did before the pandemic hit, must have just been thrilling.
Josh, it was crazy. I will tell you this, because I arrived in Calgary Grey Cup Sunday 2018. So the
Wow.
Stamps won. They beat Ottawa.
Yeah.
Remember that. So I came there. Then following that, you had the Roughnecks winning their NLL championship.
Yeah.
Then you had the Inferno winning the women's hockey championship.
Mm-hmm.
Then who else was in that mix that we had? The Dinos reaching again
Sate.
after winning the Can West. Sate also going to the national championship. So like in my first year, I got to see all these programs and pro sports franchises reach the pinnacle or get to that pinnacle. So it was crazy in my first year to kind of be blessed with that and having fun, just kind of watching all those athletes and everybody and kind of join the ride. Or the Flames were on that incredible run where they finished with the second highest point total in their history, and unfortunately bowed out to the Avalanche. But those are still cool experiences that I got to have in my very first year. Not too many people do.
Yeah.
So to have that all culminate in that 2018-19 was pretty sweet.
Yeah, I bet. Like you said, there's so much that goes on, and you hit on something so important that you talked about. Being part of this industry. I get talked to by a lot of young kids that have, number one, just hockey just in their mind. I'm just doing hockey. I don't want to cover any other sports. You have to have that side of not only having the other sports, but also having the news side of it, right? You hit so wisely on, look, we saw it last year with BLM and how that infused into sports, whether you liked it or not. And the people that didn't like it are idiots, but it made such a huge impact onto the sporting world, right? And we saw how that affected to take games off and take a break from it. And that was that crossover why you have to be ready to be a news broadcaster just as much as a sports broadcaster.
You know, this there's probably people listening to this broadcast that would know. Remember Al Michaels back in the late '80s? It was the
Yeah.
World Series, Oakland against San Francisco, and there was that earthquake
Earthquake, yeah.
that hit. And he won an Emmy for his broadcast because they still went live, and he was kind of describing what happened, what was transpiring, people obviously being shaken, and he won an Emmy for that. He's a sports broadcaster that won an Emmy for his performance. Not saying they don't, but I mean for what he did there, where he transitioned from being a sports play-by-play analyst to a live reporter on the scene reporting what is transpiring here in this certain area of the Bay Area. An earthquake that's kind of hit, people being injured, whatnot, receiving the information. It was truly remarkable to kind of see how that transpires in an instant. You talk about BLM. We saw that, even with the Canadian Premier League, you saw players talk about this. So when you're asking them the questions, it's not, hey, how are the games going? Like really at the end of the day, that's moot. Like the main focus was, you're hearing what's happened. You heard what happened to George Floyd. You're starting to see more, incidents involving like a Breonna Taylor, that sort of thing, where it's really impacting the culture, right?
Yeah.
These people are affected too because they could feel like that's their brother, their sister, their mother. And those who are not necessarily affected are like, huh. So I'm seeing a person that's my teammate or a player that is I'm coaching that is going through something. And the idea of your sport is to make sure that they're 100% focused on the task. They can't be focused on the task if they're worried about what's going on at home or
Yeah.
concerned about what's going on within a social viewpoint. And you're like, huh. So you saw the transition and you saw a lot of people kind of ask different questions about that, about race, something we may have touched on, we may have heard of like back in the 60s and the 70s, but largely we saw that in the United States in particular. I'm not saying it doesn't happen here because we're now starting to see that in recent months,
Yeah.
with what's going on with Indigenous children and what's happened with the unmarked graves, right? So we're starting to kind of have that conversation and it branches out, and it kind of ties in. And you mentioned that people are so one dimensional. Sometimes you have a greater appreciation for someone or a task when you're doing everything. And I was very fortunate. So I'm not going to yell at a shooter because he didn't get this. I'll ask the questions why if there was something missing, or you know what, maybe be a little more concise when I'm talking about, hey, I need shots of this. I would like this, because I've been in their shoes where somebody told me to go somewhere and I'm like, there was no instruction. Yeah, go shoot this, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, what do you want me to get? So like, there's gonna be a lot of static shots, but you're not telling me. I'm like, hey, use creative license, go use this, blah, blah, blah. Or talk to them a little bit more. Like, what are you thinking? Like, are you like someone that you've seen that, a shooter that you work with, or someone, or, a buddy of yours at school, like, right? You're learning and you're teaming up to do a project. Well, ask them, hey, it'd be cool. I saw this. You want to try this? Like, what do you think of this? Like sometimes get that input kind of gives them a little bit of responsibility and they kind of take that. Usually
Yeah.
there's a lot of people and especially when you get into the industries and the areas like what we're doing now, like in my field, the shooters are kind of already kind of get the deal. They understand because they've been around. I'm like, hey, I need shots of this guy. I need information on this guy, blah, blah, blah. So they'll get the ISOs that I need in particular of a player, and they'll vary it just so
Yeah.
that, you can kind of transition so you don't see, jump cuts or it's so repetitive. We're like, okay, here we go. Like, this is something different. So but there are times when sometimes you're going to have to say, hey, I was really wanted to focus on this guy. I wanted to find something creative, kind of get your input, what we can do, blah, blah, blah. Just kind of, you work things and you kind of team things together. So for me, being a shooter, I understood that. Understanding what the anchors need, understanding what a reporter needs, understanding what a shooter needs, understanding what your team is. Because at the end of the day, and I always relate things to teams, right?
Right.
And we're in an industry where you're working with people, you're working as a team. You have one person that's going to be directing, you have another person that's editing, you have another person that's reporting. Well, they got to make sure that they're in a good position where they can get the information, get the voicing done for the story. You got the editor working on the pack, trying to get it all together. the production people are trying to time out the show, making sure that everything fits and prioritizing what's important. All right, we got this local story, boom, it's about 1:35, let's go, let's get this done. You're going to be on the top of the show, so you're leading off, so make sure that you have everything that you need. There's a lot of teamwork that's involved in that situation, because if there's one part that's not functioning properly, everything else is going to go to crap. So that's kind of the idea.
100%.
Just making sure that everybody is good. So it's nice when you can learn from a sympathetic standpoint and be like, yo, I can understand how that's tough. What can I do as a reporter or a shooter or an editor or whatever it may be to make sure that this story not only just gets to air, because sometimes you got to throw things together, slap it together and put it out, or if you got the time, you're like, hey, maybe you want to try this, or you talk about this shot, like right to what you see. You're like, we had this great shot, I think you should add it. So you give them the time code, boom, the editor is like, all right, I got this, puts it in there. So what you're talking about is what you see, and it works out. So there's a lot of work that has to be done together in order to make sure that the story is out there. And I think that really comes down to being sympathetic, understanding, empathetic, just being like, okay, I can understand how stressful this is because they got other priorities. I'm going to do my thing, make sure it's done, be concise, and then help out others when needed. So one of the things that I've learned, especially in my industry, is because we moved to more what's called like a video journalist, right? VJs.
Yeah.
So so they're doing all in one. So you definitely learn that, not only when you're in a smaller market, but you still see that here in the bigger markets. So here in Calgary, we have VJs. So the amount of work that they're doing, and they're doing it remote because of COVID, there's only a handful of people that are really essential that need to be at work, right? So the anchors need to be at work, but a lot of the reporters can do it from home. Well, you also got to deal with the internet. So you got a lot of challenges trying to put things together. And, it's not necessarily an enviable task, but to watch them do what they do is pretty amazing. And it just ties down to making sure that, everybody is good from a mental standpoint, from a standpoint of like understanding what people need, the deadlines, and you become a better team for it. So, there's a lot of things that kind of have to tie in order to be successful. And just kind of end that note, because I know I've touched on it. You mentioned this before about how, when you leave a station or go somewhere, your reputation follows you, right? So you leaving on a good note is great.
Such a small industry.
100%. And I remember this, and it reminds me, and if you grow up in a small town, you know how news travels fast, right? Even people you might not necessarily know, they know you.
Yep.
This industry is just the same. Think of our industry as a small town. You piss off somebody here, chances are they got a friend of a friend, or they know people, or maybe somebody that was at that station that you worked with ended up moving up, goes out to a Toronto, goes out to a Vancouver, whatever, a bigger market. Doesn't necessarily have to be there, but you try to get to the next level. You're pissing people off. You're burning those bridges. You're not saying bon voyage to, Lloydminster, or bon voyage to Lethbridge, or whatever. Like, no, that news travels with you because they'll follow you. There are people out there like, yeah, I worked with him. He's crazy. I know for a fact that the jobs that I've gotten, and I particularly here, I was very fortunate. There are many people who are talented that could have had my job. I don't doubt that for a second, not a second at all. There are many talented people who have had perhaps more experience than I applying for that same job that I got. Absolutely. But one of the things is, can you do the job? How you look on air, voicing, you name it. You're like, okay, that's good. And then the second thing, and it's usually the clincher, is how well do they work with others? Are there people that you worked with that work there? And I know like 3 or 4 people prior to coming to Calgary that work at Global Calgary. So I don't doubt that they were like, yeah, he's good stuff. He's a good guy. I don't doubt for a second that probably put me over the top. I don't, because there's a lot of people, I'm sure, and I always feel this way, that I feel like I am talented. I'm not doubting that, but I always feel there's always somebody going to be more talented than I am. So I always feel like where I'm working, I'm constantly working up, and it constantly drives me to say, hey, there's somebody behind me that, has an incredible read, or, tell stories, whatever it may be. I don't, whatever it is. That could be, taking my job. So, or you understand, you're like, okay, well, I applied for this job. They respected me enough, and they felt that I had a lot of potential, and something that could work out and be a really great, uh, not only member of the global family, but someone that can actually really help elevate our sports department. So I always feel like, you know what, I'm blessed in terms of what I do. I'm very fortunate in what I got in terms of getting here, but I never take that for granted. I always feel like there's always a next man up. So I gotta make sure
Always.
that I step up when I show up. I'm never gonna complain. There's you don't say that because there's always ebbs and flows. Days, life just gets to you. I'm sure COVID has gotten to a lot of us, especially when the original part of the lockdown, you're stuck and cooped up at home, and some people had the luxury, if you call it a luxury, of going to work. I did because, I was considered essential,
Yeah.
call it what you will. But, coming back, just little things like that. So you just appreciate where, I'm always confident in terms of what I do, but I always have that mentality where I'm like, I'm working from the bottom and I got to work myself up. So you keep that hunger going and making sure that, you stay humble, and, you're fortunate, and sometimes you just keep your nose to the grindstone and just keep working. And, it's very fortunate. And, Josh, you said some kind words when you introduced me earlier. That's awesome. It's great to hear that. And, knowing that your work is actually yielding some results. But at the end of the day, I'm always the type of person that's like, hey, man, I'm appreciative. Just be aware of that. At the same time, keep working, and keep getting better, and having that mentality. So I was very fortunate to work with some great people here at Global Calgary, and I kind of will cherry pick and listen to their stories or how they tell stories, and kind of incorporate that if I can when I report. Primarily, I'm just anchoring right now, but getting that opportunity, just kind of learning, and it's just essentially just a really fun feeling where you're like, hey, that's something I didn't know about, or that's a cool way of presenting a story, or that shooter, how they got that. And I'm like, I want to incorporate that in a story sometime. Like, heck, man, we have guys who operate drones. I have a drone myself. We used it
Nice.
for a story. We used it for a great story that
Why
we
not?
had about one particular Olympian. She is a water polo player for Canada, and she like couldn't train due to the pandemic. So what her dad did was they bought the I guess what do you call it? I don't know why I'm blanking at the moment. You think from Saskatchewan, it's like hay bales. There we go. Like you think, yeah, and they kind of reinforced them. Then they kind of added
Like a drone,
some
like a
plastic.
like a sod, like what you put the wheat in stuff you're talking about?
Uh, Yeah, they kind of had like in barrels, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
they're
yeah, I
just
know
like
what you're
kind of
talking
like
about.
blocks. So yeah. So they
I
kind of
lived out
stack
there
them.
for a long time, for a few months too, so I'm blanking on it as well. But I have an idea what you're talking about, and I think anyone that's Canadian on the side knows what you're talking about.
Oh man, yeah, it's funny. Well, at least people can do that. I'm trying to
Yeah,
describe it, but it's tough when it's on the tip of your tongue, but you just can't.
yeah,
But yeah, for sure. But long story short, she created a pool in her own backyard using the hay bales as kind of kind of housing the water,
that's
uh,
so cool.
just so she can train shooting and whatnot. So it was a really cool story, and I got to be creative with that. So just because I like watching other stories and seeing how other people have done it, watching the people in the States. Like, one of my favorite shows to watch is E60. It's a news magazine show by ESPN. And so that's more of their feature stuff, right?
Yes,
So their stories are like, 10 minutes long. It's no different from, watching the National has a magazine segment nightly, just kind of talk, or, every so often, where they just kind of talk about a certain subject in depth. And we saw that. So and I just see how they tell a story, how they incorporate shots, how they do things. And I'm like, that's incredible. Heck, they got a story about a dog that was like, you have like Bat Boys,
yeah,
there's a team out, a AAA team in New Jersey it's a dog that retrieves baseball bats,
that's
right?
fantastic. Yeah,
Yeah, and not only that, but the original went on to pass on. He obviously fathered a couple other pups, and now one of the pups is full grown and following in his father's footsteps, right? And he's also
it's a
a
family
bat boy for the
legacy.
team. Oh, 100%. But it was so cool because they told it in such a way which was very touching, very creative, very witty, and kind of told it from the dog's perspective. They had people at Pixar kind of doing some voicing, and they just had some great work with it. And I was like, man, that's crazy. They had this great story and they told it from like a dog's perspective, which was, completely left field.
Yeah.
And no pun intended, considering we're talking about baseball, but
Yeah.
it was so cool. Like, and so for me, I got inspired by that. I'm like, hey, they get to tell a story that's very unique. Maybe I could try that, or I've heard stories about, not so much in the sports angle, but even from a news side where you're looking for a sound up and, miking the dog. I remember a news director years ago talked about when he went to I guess a conference, and they were talking about like, hey, creative ways to kind of tell a story. There was a story about a guy who mic'd the dog. It involved like, I don't know if it was rescue dogs. The story in particular, I'm kind of hazy on, but but when it comes to what they did, they're like, yeah. So they wanted to get the dog's perspective, so they like put a GoPro on the dog. They actually put a mic on the dog so you can hear it panting and breathing and kind of doing its thing. But it added a different element to a story. So I thought that was neat. And those have always stuck with me. And I try to, whenever I'm going out to do a story, if I can, what's a way to tell this story that's going to be different from, say, my competition at CTV or, or wherever else, right? Or just personally besting the stuff that I've done that I've always appreciated. And I'm like, how can I take the next step? So those are some of the things that I kind of look for when it comes to, finding those stories and, working and kind of going on that grind and trying to get better on top of, not being a screw up and being able to work with people.
Yeah, you work with some great people. I mean, you get to work with someone that I was a year behind me at SAIT, but is one of the hardest working people I've ever met in this industry, in Cami Kepke, who is like one. I don't know many people that like sports more than her. And you have that passion as well, which you can feel in the broadcast and definitely feeling today on the podcast. And Adam McVicker also was a year behind, and his work ethic is unlike anyone I've ever seen. That's a guy that wanted to be a broadcaster more than anyone I've really ran into. And with both of them, you have the pleasure of working with them. And I think it's almost perfect on serendipitous in some ways that you and Cami are working together on the sports side, because you can sense that drive in both of you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's fun to work with somebody who likes to challenge you as well. And by that, I mean, like, they're so passionate, it makes you want to be a go-getter as well.
Yeah.
I think that's another thing. It's who you work with can either bring you down or, elevate you. And I think there's certain elements that we both have, Cami and myself, that want us to kind of elevate what we do, how we tell sports, how our sports broadcast should be, and how we can move forward, especially when it comes to local sports, really kind of hammering that stuff home.
You guys are both from smaller towns too, and I think that helps that you guys came from smaller towns and then coming now to Calgary. I think that does have an effect of looking at some of those local sports a little bit differently.
Oh yeah, and I grew up, growing up in Saskatoon. There's only one pro sports team, and that's the Saskatchewan Roughriders.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, especially when I originally, well, I guess my second return to Saskatoon and working with CTV as a sports reporter and anchor there, I knew this, that once they started taking away the sports, you had a lot of angry viewers, and you realize that sponsorship was a big thing. And they were like, look, if you're not putting any riders, like, what's the point? Like, you know what I mean? Because there are a lot of eyes on the riders. Not only that, but university sports, like the University of Saskatchewan Huskies, when it comes to their, how rabid a fan base they are for university sports. You have the Saskatoon Hilltops, much like our Calgary Colts here, when it comes
Notre
to
Dame.
junior football, right? And then you got high school football, like high school sports in general. So you got a lot of people who are passionate about local sports, and that I think that turns here, because look, I've always believed this: the Flames, awesome, great organization to work with, good people in house, but we all know they're part of the National Hockey League. They're a pro sports franchise. They got their own group of people, talking about their sports, right? They have Flames TV. Not only that, but they have the National Hockey League. They have Sportsnet, right? So
ESPN and Turner now.
Yeah, yes. Oh gosh, that's crazy dollars that they're putting out there too in the States. But it's good for the NHL, I guess. They need revenue. But when you look at those franchises, like those pro sports franchises, the Stampeders to a different extent, we already know you're going to see their highlights on TSN, Sportsnet, the major sports channels, right? You're going to get that information instantly. You're not going to get that with high school sports. You're telling me St. Francis is taking on Notre Dame. You're telling me that's going to be on the ESPN top 10? That's going to be on TSN's top 10?
Unless something crazy happens.
Unless, yeah, exactly. Unless it's just like a freak trick play that
Yeah.
ends up catching the eye, and then even then he'll probably get 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So for us, learning and understanding that, there's some kids out in Lacombe, man, they were just balling out. I want to say was it Lacombe High School? I'm trying to remember.
Sounds right.
Yeah, sounds about right. I was Lacombe. I'm trying to remember the name. It's a school out in the Northeast here.
Yeah, Father Lacombe.
Father Lacombe, thank you.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking Lacombe is a small town, so Father Lacombe would be in particular. Yo,
Yeah.
those kids can play, and they're so much
Mhm.
fun to watch. And it's funny because when you see these kids when they're getting interviewed, they're getting hyped up. Like, oh, camera's here. All right, let me put on a show. And it's funny to see. And the kids have a good laugh at it. The kids want to impress, because they want to see their highlights on TV. And in turn, what that does is it brings people to watch us.
Yeah.
Like I said, you can see the Stampeders, you can see the Flames, you can watch their highlights, you can watch it on your phone, you can get it instantly. You don't even have to watch the sports channels, right? You could, like, literally, you can get highlights by the minute from their Twitter, from TikTok, whatever it is, right? IG, all the same. But the difference is, for high school sports, you don't get that. University sports, you still don't get that love unless you're in the national championship. And even then, the coverage is not necessarily, yeah, exactly. It's quite small. It's not going to be to the point where you're going to see, like, with, you're kind of, it's like inundated in your face with the Stampeders and the Flames. And there's no knock on them. It's just, they're professional sports. They have the revenue. They have the backing of, multi-million, multi-billion dollar leagues, right? Or like money that's being kind of churned in. So they have no problem with that. Whereas high school sports, no, they don't. University sports here in Canada, it's not like the NCAA. It's not like big bucks where, you got, the NCAA making, I think it was like the last contract that they had with CBS for the March Madness was like $2.7 billion.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's crazy. Yeah. Billion with a B. Insane. You're not going to see that same type of money coming here. Right. So for me, that's our focus. Always has been, because we know people will tune in to watch Global to see those highlights of, junior lacrosse. They want to see minor hockey, right? They want to go see, whatever, it doesn't matter what sport, but even if there was like a story involving an athlete locally, they'll tune in to watch that. So our focus has always been, and I feel Academy is much the same. Like we understand the industry that it's all local. That really keeps people motivated, keeps people interesting. And if it's on a pro side, provide something that you're not going to find on your Sportsnets or your TSNs. That's essentially what it comes down to, because you want to bring those viewers to you, and you're providing something that's going to be different from the rest.
And the one thing Cammie was saying, I was interested in your side, is the archive that you guys get to go through. It's so deep. And you guys probably haven't touched the surface on the archives that are global, from Stampede Wrestling to 88 to Drillers to Cannons. There's a Dwayne Johnson for a Stampeders workout. Like, there's so much in those archives that you guys could do probably like your own 30 for 30s on them.
Oh, without a doubt. Kind of looking back, and you look at the tie-ins, and I know we tried reaching out to this, but I think I forget his first name. I think it was England was his last name. I'm trying
Chip
to remember.
English. He is hard to reach, and I do work with a radio station in San Antonio, and even I couldn't reach him. So
yeah, exactly. And because of course, an assistant out with the Spurs.
Yeah, help Kawhi.
Exactly.
Yeah,
like if you look Kawhi shot and helped him out. He was largely in part of that. And he was a great shooter when he played for the 88s here many years ago. So, there's always a tie-in, and somehow that it kind of leads in. So that's like a great way to kind of, find a story that is like more of a global, national type feel and coverage, international at times, and then bring it down. It's like Scott Kennedy with the Canadian men's soccer team. Dude grew up at, Calgary West, played there, had a dream of playing professionally. He's playing out in the second division of the Bundesliga, got a call up for the Canadian men's national team, was so exceptional, was highly touted by his own manager, John Herdman, that they brought him into the Gold Cup team. And you know what? He was part of the Olympic qualifying or World Cup qualifying. He's going to be part of more World Cup qualifying when it happens this fall. And you know what? If Canada just so happens, and I have a strong belief that Canada is going to make the 2022 World Cup in the men's side.
I think so.
How cool would it be to see Scott Kennedy make it? Not quite Oren Hargraves. Hargraves did, but obviously
Yeah.
went to England, represent England.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to have a kid to represent his country playing playing in the world stage, hey, you're playing the second division in Europe. That's not a bad thing. Like that's some good level competition. You can imagine how hard it is to get to those top levels. And
Oh,
who knows?
so
His
hard.
future is only 24, so his future is bright. He can end up going into the first division in Belgium or go play in France. We saw that with, for example, Jonathan David, who's a kid who was born in the States but grew up in Ontario.
Yeah.
Right? Like things like that, where you can see these kids all of a sudden develop, and having a local person and be like, oh, that's a different angle from it. And
It
it's
helps
neat to
grow the
see him.
game too, right? Like, I mean,
100%.
we're talking about Team Canada basketball. I talked with Lisa Tomaitis about it,
Mm-hmm.
and her just talking about like, yeah, there's just more growth in Ontario because the Raptors had a big factor of it, obviously, and the East Coast because there's that. And it's unfortunate that in Alberta we don't really have that. I think it's still such a hockey country, but having a soccer player, right, to grow and be like, oh, I can see myself there, and you guys putting that out. Like the closest we've had was Jordan Paczynski, who played for a bunch of, I think he now works for the Pacers as a scout. But that's the closest we have to like a Calgarian really in the league. He played for the Knicks G League team with Jimmer Fredette, but never got to put his heels in for Calgarians to be like, oh, look, that's us. But to have someone on that World Cup stage where you're, like you said, I think they can firmly make 2022 and their automatic bid for 2026, it's a huge chance to grow it.
Absolutely. And I was thinking, because I know it's a complete side note, but for like Montreal bowing out of being one of the host cities here in Canada for 2026,
Yeah.
I'm not saying Calgary's going to get it. It's most likely going to go to Vancouver. I think that's the next
Yeah.
best option with BC Place. But,
Yeah.
I'm thinking if these teams want warm-up games or tune-up games, why not come to Calgary? Spruce Meadows by then should have about a 10,000 seat,
You think?
pitch, right? Or arena.
Calvary have been
Or
killing
field.
it with their stadium.
Oh yeah, it's small. It's like about just short of 6,000, I guess, but in
The
capacity.
support,
But
I guess.
I've been
The
there.
support's been
Oh,
great.
100%. Well, they've
Yeah.
had that groundswell for a long time, because you talk about some of the old soccer teams in there, right? There's quite a few teams
Boomers.
throughout the years that have come up, and I think prior to this it was like the early 2000s, right?
Yep.
So you saw, and we see with the Foothills, playing both on the men and women's side. It's really cool to see that you're starting to see the growth and starting to see players. There's Arabin Pebble, who grew up here in Canada, was from immigrant parents, grew up here. Now he's playing for the U18 team in Getafe for the Spanish side. So, and not only that, because he got a tryout in England with a couple teams, didn't work out. Ended up going to Getafe, stuck with the U18 team, and looks to be excelling. So that's cool. And watching him develop, watching him from and the dude is crazy. He's only like 18 right now, like going on 19. And like he's already built like a brick house. Like he's a dude. Like think of Roman Lukaku. Roman Lukaku with Belgium. Think of like that. Just if he fills out more, he's just going to be a beast in the box. And but he's got ties to Calgary, and watching him inspire other kids in the neighborhood, is really cool. And you see that with the other kids that have gone through the U Sports program that have lived out here in Calgary and have been picked by Cavalry. So you got that local aspect. It's really nice, because then people look to that, and you're 100% right that it comes down to getting the exposure. That's where we come in, and providing that for the athletes or the teams, you name it. And not only that, but even if they don't make pro, even if it doesn't, how cool is it if you're thinking, if these people grow up 20, 30 years down the road and they're showing their, their kids, or, maybe you fast forward a little bit more and they're showing their grandkids, yo, your pops used to ball, or I was, when I was young, and, I was dominating the women's game. You know what I mean? Like you have these stories of both these athletes on the men's and women's side that could really come out and just be like, here's something that we have eternally forever, stuff how, I used to play, and it brings back fond memories when we won the city championship or the provincial championship. Those things always stick with you. And to be part of that is cool. Because, there's a lot of thankful parents out there who, who see their kids on TV and they're just like, that's a proud moment. We're keeping this as a keepsake. There's so many. So for me to be I'm only a small part of that, right? Like we as an industry, we're just like, hey, we're just covering a sport. It's really cool. But for these parents, it means so much more to them. And I've had parents compliment, our coverage when it comes to like local sports and how much it means to them and how they're like, hey, can you show it to us? Can you get us a copy? Can you record this? Blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, hey, normally it's going to be a little bit of a trouble to do so, but tune in, PVR it, do whatever you can. We'll be on at 11. I remember, a couple kids that were, a couple guys who drove out to Denver. So it was during the Stanley Cup playoffs, with the Flames, and they were out there and we were covering it live. And we had a couple guys who drove all the way from Calgary to Denver, Colorado to watch the Flames. And I think it was game 4 of that series.
Yeah.
And, they're phoning the parents. I'm like, hey, you guys want to be on TV? They're like, blah, blah, blah. I need you guys to help me out when I'm doing my story. Like, I'm going to talk about, hey, there's this kid that's going to be coming into the lineup and I want you guys to shout his name. So I had them behind me. They cooperated. They're like, cool, cool, cool. And they got to do it. And sure enough, they got to be on TV and they got to experience that. And they had them recording it. And I think they tagged me on social media. And I was like, that was cool. Because that's a special moment for them. Because they're not athletes, but they're like, hey, you know what? This is local TV. Let's have some fun. And sure enough, they were awesome at what they did. So for me, that's the cool part. You get to meet new people, get to talk to them. And
the community imprint.
Oh, 100%. And I think that bodes well for us in the long term. It directly helps us. I'm not going to lie about it because, we're getting our faces out there, but we're being part of that fabric of the community. And that's another point. You mentioned that, Josh, and I think is bang on. We want to be, I'm not just, hey, Moses that you see on TV. You see me on the street. You're like, hey, what's up? I will respond. I got no problem with that. I'm not above anything. I'm like, oh, you guys watch? Well, I appreciate that. And I'm glad that we can provide a service that helps you guys out too. And, something that provide those long lasting memories.
Yeah, I think that's the thing too, that, I think some go into this and that I've learned as I've been around to colleges a lot is getting to call those games for those kids. Right. And to have those calls. And then the parents are so grateful for it. Right. And those type of things, you're like, oh, maybe you don't even realize it at first when you're a broadcaster, but as you start going on, you're like, oh, I don't even really care about myself. It's so cool that I get to project these stories for these other people that they get to live forever. Whether for me, like on the play-by-play side, if I'm calling a big time 3 or a shot or a goal for somebody, right? There was a kid on state that was from Brazil and I called a hat trick and I found the Spanish definition for it and did it, Portuguese definition for it. And his parents contacted me an email like, we're so grateful you did it in Portuguese. And because I've been on the other side of that, having someone, and for you, obviously you said you had the kids and they come on and they get to kind of tell their story and be like, oh, I'm so grateful that my story got to get told because of you. Thank you.
Oh yeah, and it's great. And you know what? If they grow up and if a parent wants to embarrass their child,
yeah,
we got receipts. So we're cool with that. And we always have a good laugh. So it's always fun, man. Like it's one of the most enjoyable things is like when you get to talk to parents or students or, and just you're basically just talking. That's it. Like, it's not like, oh, we're doing this expose on something. Like, no, you're just having a conversation like we are right now on this podcast, and kind of gelling and it kind of create,
right?
It kind of like forms its own. Like it's not like, we can have like a set, we can have a set list. Or it kind of ideas of how we want this to go, but then it kind of takes on its own nuance and, becomes something maybe much more or much better than we kind of expect.
Why Lethbridge College? Was there other choices? Ryerson, Sate, Nate? Was there other choices, or was Lethbridge the one that you wanted to go to?
Lethbridge, primarily because of my friend. She recommended me. Her sister was a DJ out there and liked Lethbridge, and was like, hey, maybe you want to try it out. They have a broadcast school, so it wasn't necessarily I'm like, oh, looking at Sate or whatever. It was just I had a connection with someone that also had had family that lived out there, so there was some kind of support, but also just the opportunity to take that broadcasting. And I know I was looking up the school and, there were quite a few people, and even our old news director out in Saskatoon, she went there. And so like, and, she's, I think she's like the station manager now, but, she's a salt of the earth woman for sure. And, she's a huge baseball fan and a Cubs fan. So luckily she got to see her team win a World Series before she dies. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because, she's got many more years to go. But what I'm saying is like, you can be like a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, and chances are, you're probably not going to see one in your lifetime. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
Not trying to wish that upon you, but shoot, I think they barely had color TV the last time they won in 60.
67.
Yeah.
It's like
So
me
like
with England right now with my granddad talking the other day. He's like, I
66.
was 22 years old. I'm like, oh my God.
Oh, yeah. That's been a minute for sure.
Yeah.
No, it's so funny just to kind of you kind of see that. So my reason of going to Lethbridge was due to my friend recommended me to the school. I saw the program. I saw people who came through that program. There was another guy who ended up being like a Washington bureau chief for Global. Ended up being a head of the news division now for Global, and he went to that school, and kind of just seeing like some of the names that went there, and you're like, okay, this is it's not just like a fly by night program. And
No,
I
it's
enjoyed
not.
my time there. Got to cover the Lethbridge Hurricanes when I was in college. We had the Scotties
Nice.
tournament hearts out there too, and you're like right, and the school is located right by the NMAX Center, or NMAX Center. So unless it's changed its name now, but that's what it was known then. So it's easy to kind of like, hey, we want to take our equipment, we want to cover stories. It's just a stone's throw. So we were in a
Yeah.
good position to be where I was at, and even covering Lethbridge, University, U of L sports too was pretty neat in that aspect. So to answer your question, it was because of a friend that recommended me there. I did my research. I ended up going there, enjoyed it. I liked the city, and I stuck around for the 2 years.
So I'm gonna have to unfortunately go to a little bit of a downside now. You were in Sask still when the Humboldt Broncos situation happened, and being from that area, obviously, it hit us all as Canadians. But being from Sask, obviously, a little bit more impactful. Did you have any relations to the Broncos beforehand? And obviously, kind of tell me how the reporting and everything of that went for you for those weeks and months.
So I was returning back to Saskatoon. So I probably was there. Would it be not quite a full year just yet?
Yeah.
So it wasn't quite. I don't think it was quite a full year in Saskatoon. So I was kind of getting myself reacquainted, because
Mhm.
there's a lot of changes that go along
Sure.
with these programs, right? With coaches, players, obviously, there's going to be a huge rotation. So for my time when I covered the Broncos, when I go out there and get elements for our sports reporters as a shooter, to spending my time being there as a sports reporter, there was a gap. But with that said, we still did stories with the Broncos. We still covered the Broncos. So you knew some, like the board of governors, some of the bigger players out there. They were always friendly to you, because they're like, hey, we're getting media coverage. We're great. And there's a couple kids I know that played for the Blades that kind of were back and forth between now their major junior and junior A. So that wasn't there. But you talk about the impact. Yeah, you see it. And our we had another sports guy who did the coverage, and I remember where I was when that one all went down. I was in the newsroom. I was kind of heading out. I did my shift, so at this time I was more so on the news side of things. And
This is when they intersect.
oh yeah, 100%. And I remember getting a call, and we're just hearing that the game, it was a playoff game between the Estevan Bruins and the Humboldt Broncos, because they were going up to Estevan to play, um, was postponed. And at that point, we didn't know if it was indefinite. They just said that there was a crash on the highway, so we didn't know the impact. So we had our other our sports guy there. He's making calls, talking to the coach, trying to reach out to the coach, because he talked to him like, I don't know, like days before. So
Yeah.
it wasn't like anything. And he was trying to reach out to whoever he could. He wasn't getting an answer. They were unfortunately involved in the crash. So you're trying this panic, and then all of a sudden you're starting to see this news start rolling out. Some people that we knew from the sports circles are kind of feeding in information to our guys, and they were saying, hey, this was happening. This is what's going down. So, our sports guy and all them drove all the way there. I stayed the rest of the night at work, because we're trying to see if there's any information, trying to make sure that we get the breaking news out, whatever it is, to make sure that, everything is, factually accurate. We're not saying something, we had people calling in, both good and bad, just saying, why are you showing this? And, swearing at us. And we're like, we're not trying to show this to glorify the accident. We're just showing out the shocking events, and we're just trying to do this all in real time. So you don't really have, it's much like with COVID, you don't know how to deal with things. There's no proper protocol at this point. You're right there in an accident. It just happened. Like, what do you do? Obviously they started stepping in, and things start coming into place. We're not going to repeatedly show that, because that is traumatic for especially those who had a loved one involved in that.
Mhm.
So you see what's kind of transpired throughout that, and that was so tough. I know we had there was a couple, I think Saskatoon kids that were also a part of that, so there was that local tie-in trying to reach out to their families and what's going on. Our sports guy who was out there for the entire night, so he was doing packs. He was talking to some of the major sports networks because they were been phoning in trying to getting details. So he was doing lives. I'm just kind of manning the station, making sure that we get the information that was proper out to our anchors and all that stuff. So it was a really interesting time. And then, it didn't really hit until probably days after when you realize like who was involved, how many were in the hospital, how many died instantly. Then you started getting reports of what happened. I was on that road too. I've been on that road and follow that stop sign. The trucker blew through that stop sign. So you're thinking to yourself, oh man. And when I was there, so I kind of just envisioned what it would be like and how scary that is when you're just driving up to a game, you're joking around with your buddies in on the bus, and then all of a sudden, boom, your life changes in an instant. We look at Straczynski, for example, right? Dude's trying to learn to walk again, and all the power to him. That guy is working his butt off to get to a stage where he can have that normal life, right, or get back to some sense of it. But his life is permanently rocked from an emotional and mental standpoint, but the dude's just working. Those are inspirational stories that came out of it that you can find and talk about. Even through the dark time, there is dawn ahead. But others didn't get that choice. Others didn't get that. And
No.
you have parents now that had this closure that were trying to figure out, okay, we know that our son, I know there's one, the trainer, the woman who died as well. They lost a son, they lost a daughter, someone lost a husband or a wife, right? There are many people that were touched by this. And I was covering the funerals in Saskatoon for the players. And, it's definitely, it hits home because you realize, I remember talking to one of the kids, U18 or not U18, but like even like Pee Wee and I think it was his well, you would call it midget. I guess they changed the name out there, but like
Yeah.
U18s
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
Um, his coach, and the tears rolling down his face, like the players. You had like all sorts of levels, family, friends, those teammates, just all come together for this family, and not only that, but how it touched everyone. I think it's surprising if you didn't feel anything.
Of
And,
course.
you know, in growing up in the prairies, how big that was. And it's not something that was distant in our minds or we never conceived. If you remember in the late 80s, the Humboldt Bronco crash, or sorry, not the Humboldt, Swift Current Broncos.
Oh yeah.
And you look at players that were on that bus. Sheldon Kennedy, who's an NHLer, former Flame as well, was on that bus. Joe Sakic was on that bus. 4 members of that team died, right? So
Yeah.
the impact is still left. Like you still see the impact left, and Sheldon immediately would reach out to these people for that very reason because he knew what they were going through. That's a shock, and he's a survivor. Like he turned out, obviously there's a lot of, of his background is a very interesting one, but in particular when it comes to that, you think to yourself, you're like, holy smokes, like these people lost a loved one, especially so young because these kids were like 17 to 21, right? So you're thinking to yourself, dang, how life is so short and how life can be gone. Like you and I can talk here and, I could drop dead right now in this interview.
I know.
You know what I mean? Like it just, you don't know when your time is going to go. So to see someone that's so young and to lose their life the way they did, it's not by, anything of their own. And you talk about like Merz Lekins, who with the Columbus Blue Jackets, if I got that last name right. Yeah.
Yeah,
You
that
look at,
was wild.
that is just a crazy story, but you look at it, it's still 24, regardless of how it happens. It's still young. And it's like, it puts things in perspective. And I've been on this planet for quite some time, well over 3 decades.
Yeah,
And
me
I'm just
too.
like, yeah, we won't necessarily give out the age of you.
No, I'm not ready anymore for that. I'm not doing that
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a funny story with that on the side, but just kind of
Sure.
finishing off this point and being serious here. It's just, you were touched and you saw how it impacted families and being able to tell that. And I think that's one of the juggling acts. You talk about that crossover between news and sports. But being able to tell a story that is really touching and very, a sensitive topic about someone dying, but being able to tell it in a way that, you see the parents and people being appreciative. You're like, hey, thank you for doing it. They wanted to get a story out, and the way it was told, and way it gripped people's hearts, and the emotion, and all like that. But you just got it felt like people were coming together in a sense of, uh, community that kind of gets involved in that, and you're just a bit part that you're not there to be a face, you're just there to tell a story,
Yeah.
right? And you're guiding it. And I've always felt like sometimes if you have a really, and this is a little bit perhaps off topic, but if you have a really good story, if you have something that really touches people, don't always throw yourself or interject yourself. Let them do the talking. That's my opinion on it.
Never let
So
yourself be part of the story, be part
no,
or the story.
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
you're doing a stand up. If you're a bridge, you put in a bridge or something like that. If you're transitioning, totally cool. I'm not arguing that point. But what
Yeah.
I mean is, when I'm telling the story, I say it is something as impactful. I say very little words as possible, right? I let them carry the story. So you start off with them talking about how emotional it is, the journey, and then you kind of help guide the listener, the viewer through that, and you kind of you're bridging the hole. So
You're just
this is what
narrating.
happened. Yeah, exactly. But you talk about the impact. I do this where I'm like, you talk about the hurt or the pain or something that they're feeling, the emotion. I never say, hey, they're emotional, or they're feeling the pain, or
Yeah.
this is hurtful. I'm like, why do I have to say it? I'm gonna let them say it, because then you have that sense. You're like, hey, if that was my kid, if that was my spouse, if that was my, someone that was really near and dear to you that passed away, and you're connecting with that story, I think you do so much. It's more, you do such a service to it, and that's where it kind of ties in. And I think you had such great stories of great parents who are going through such a tough time, who are telling this story, even forgiving the bus driver for what, or even the driver, it's not the bus driver, but the driver that ended up running the stop sign. And you saw the compassion. Those are things that you're like, you can see and you can turn around, and if you follow the story, how kind of everything turned out. But I think, you're touched in one way, and these are sensitive stories to kind of touch upon. You want to make sure that you're doing a great job. You're not going to butcher this. You're like, let them tell the story. I want to hear from the mother. I want to hear from the kid. I want to hear from that significant other. I want to hear, and they get it's. I'm not saying it's an experience where, because I'm not in their shoes, because
Mhm.
obviously I am removed. It's not someone that's I loved, but I can see the pain that's on their face. But somehow to be able to tell that story is something that they um, they can share, and are very appreciative in that sense. Because I'm not going to say that it's very helpful. I think they're appreciative, because I'm not in their shoes, and I can't say it was. I've had people thank me for letting the story be told about their child or something, but I'm not going to say that, I can't read their mind. But what I do know is that we try to do the best we can, and try to let them tell the story, and being able to put it in a subject where, to honor both the person who passed away, as well as the families that are grieving and those who are grieving.
Was that the biggest story you've had to be a part of to date, you'd say, in your young career?
That's a good question, man. I've been around for a minute, so I'm trying to figure out if there have been other ones. I've covered stories that involve death
Yeah. I mean,
uh,
obviously we just had a
a few
pandemic
times.
as well.
Well, yeah, absolutely, right.
Yeah.
And so you try to, and I'm trying to think of like really big stories, even on the news side. Right now, my memory skips me, but I would have to say, in terms of the most impactful, like, yeah, I remembered where I was when the news came out.
Me
I
too.
remembered, you know, the feeling that I had in that chair when I was at my desk. I remember kind of running. We had a lot of people who stayed hours after their shift because they wanted to make sure that everything was good, or were trying to grab elements, or whatever it is, right? I think there's a lot of factors in that aspect where um, the memories last long. So I guess I'd have to say that for now, just because of the impact it had on everybody. And remember how distinctive, like, the memory is just there. I can close my eyes and be like, I'm at that spot already. I know where I was at my desk,
Yeah.
looking at the phone calls, all that stuff.
Yeah. I was in an award ceremony for SAIT, and unfortunately, some of the SAIT players knew some of the players on that team and played with some of them. And I'll remember the howls for the rest of my life. And just me looking at my color commentator and be like, I think it's time to leave, because I think this, and the ceremony, from my understanding, was just shut down after that, because how could you keep on going on when the hockey team at State had close ties to some of those guys, and it was like, this isn't a spot for us to be right now. There's going to be a lot of grieving and some really unfortunate times to have here. We need to move on. And it you know, anyone that's been in Sask that covered that, I envy them. Just because I don't envy them in some ways, because it was incredibly hard. I'm sure. I know Cammie was there as well covering that, and she talked about how difficult it was. And I think, though, like, you being from that area, that carries a different tide to it all.
And he talked about it, like how many of these kids, and kind of like on our industry that I mentioned, you know, on a different note, that people know people. You know, you either work with them, you graduated with them from school, you know, whatever it is. You see that in sports. You see that in hockey all the time, because there are kids who are playing in the dub. There are kids who are playing junior A elsewhere, right?
They
They're
grow
growing
up,
half across.
right?
They're playing in Europe. They grew up with them. They were neighbors, right? And it's just the impact that everybody felt. And even those who were not necessarily affected, like hockey parents around this country, and you could argue globally, were like, oh, I could not imagine to lose my son or daughter in a situation like that.
No, and again, like, I think you did, you know, you have, just from the early senses of watching it, not to, you know, brag too much about your stuff, but and pump you up too much, but you have had this ability to, when you said you kind of look for that magazine stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, that's kind of a little bit of what you can see in your packages. You kind of get that mix, and it's, you know, it's really well done with everything. Give you so much of your time, but I got a few questions here. We'll kind of move it to a little bit of a lighter side. I got 2 or 3 more questions, and we'll get out of here, because
sure.
that was so hard. What sports did you play growing up?
You know, I played like street hockey. I didn't necessarily get the chance to kind of play hockey. The cost was, you know, a bit too high. It was a little bit different from that time, but I did play football. I played basketball. You know, whenever I could. Later on, I tried curling. That was interesting. I do appreciate the sport. I do appreciate the sport, but I was like, holy smokes. You know, it's not just like, oh, you're throwing a rock. You know, no, there's quite a bit of skill that's involved in it too. And, you know, like got those in-turns, out-turns, and, you know, how they're making those shots. And it's crazy to see some of the athletes that we have here in Canada just doing what they're doing on the pebbled ice, man. So I did a little bit of that, but primarily it was just like basketball and football.
What's been your favorite broadcast memory to date?
But in industry, or just like all together that I remember from the
altogether? Yeah, even if you had something in college that was up there.
Broadcast memory. I think one that came to mind, but this is like when I was working and you followed the team, was when the University of Saskatchewan's men's basketball team won the CIS championship. I think that was cool. You know, going from, you know, I like the line from Rod Black, you know, said it best, you know, going from underdog to top dog. I thought that was pretty cool. So watching them, because you're watching these kids, they're like, they had some great talent, but they were snubbed in the awards ceremonies, and everybody's like praising, like, oh, you know, they're going saying Carleton's got to do this, they're going to be doing blah 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 blah, right?
It's always Carleton, isn't it?
Schools. Yeah, well, hands down. Well, you know, they got a good program in their own right, man. You can't.
They do, yeah.
But what was really cool was, you know, the fact that they got through all those to get to the final and winning it. I thought that was really cool. So that stayed with me, and then of course the ceremony and a couple of the players that I did appreciate. Michael Linklater, of course, ended up playing some 3-on-3 ball.
He did, yep.
You know, trying to help out with that, bringing that sport, you know, at least popularity into Canada. And, you know, it was obviously popular in Europe, but seeing it here, and it was really cool.
It's growing.
You know, having been part of those, covering it too, because Saskatoon was one of the Canadian stops. Yeah, I think it was. I don't know if it was the only Canadian stop, or maybe just like 2 of them, and then we were the one. Yeah, that sort of thing. So it was really neat to have a program like that where you're seeing a lot of these global players and having that event. So that was a really cool tie-in. I will say that one time we were playing at a field house and we're playing basketball, and I crossed him up and he slipped. That's my only highlight.
There you go.
Yeah, I don't know he remembers it, but I do safely, because I was like, oh shoot, I crossed up Linklater. And of course, well, he killed me the rest of the way, but it's
always good when you do that
to this day.
When you do, I did that. I beat Craig Adamson, who plays for the 3-on-3 Canada team as well, and I beat him 1-on-1. We've never played again since, and I'm like, He's like, we need to play again. I'm like, never,
Yeah.
never gonna
No,
play
I'm officially
ever
retiring.
again because I beat you 1-on-1. Instead of asking what your best sports take is, what has been your worst sports take?
Oh, that was great. Oh yeah, that I could definitely know. It was so
The one
funny.
you could hold the biggest L on.
Oh yeah, I've had a couple.
Yeah,
Well,
we all
it's
have.
life, man. Well, let's
Yeah,
put it this way: if you're gonna have an opinion, what they say about opinions, like a-holes. Everybody's got one, right?
yeah,
I don't know if we can swear on this whole, but
yeah, yeah, a little bit.
I'll keep it PG. But you get the the
Yep,
definition. I think you can
yep.
leave a lot to the imagination there. So everybody's got opinions and certain things. I think there's two that stood out. I remember one when Dak Prescott went down, and I didn't think Andy Dalton was a bad quarterback, but I thought he was serviceable, and I thought, you know what? I don't think they're going to go out and win the Super Bowl, but I think they'll still be competitive until he comes back, or if he comes back that season at all. And somebody like this added me with another NFL player, and we're like, "Dude, we're sports takes or something like that." And I was like,
Freezing.
"All
Was it
right,
like
well,
freezing cold takes or something?
I don't know. I forget what it was. It was something
Yeah,
else. All I did was burst out laughing, and I was like, "All right,
yeah,
well, we'll see if this ages well."
yeah,
Well, it didn't. So
yeah.
there was that. But I remember another one was actually quite funny, and I replied to the guy because I was like, "Hey, you know what? If I'm going to talk the talk, I better walk the walk. So like, I'm going to take, I'm going to, I'm going to be saying stuff. I'm going to take the criticism if I'm wrong, and I'm cool with that because I think that's what you do. It's like if you're at a bar with your buddies, if you call something, you get it wrong, they're going to joke around with you and be like, all right, I'll hold that L. I get it. And I remember
Mhm.
the one, it was when I just started out in Lethbridge, and not Lethbridge, sorry, Lloydminster, and the Lakeland College. So you're familiar. They had some great men's basketball teams, right?
Boy, did
Some
they.
really good ones. I remember
Boy,
there's
did
one where they
they.
went 20-0, and it was my first year there.
Yeah.
So, and then they had the way the rules were made was they had play-in tournaments. So I think it was McEwen and somebody else that had a play-in tournament. And I remember saying in my broadcast, I'm like, oh, the winner of that play-in tournament has the right to lose to the Lakeland College wrestlers in the first round. Well, the opposite was true. They ended up getting
Yikes.
swept when they came here 2 games to nothing. And then I guess the guy who played for the team added me on Twitter, and just like, blah, blah, blah. And I only replied, I'm like, hey, man, you did what you did. I didn't think it was done. And I put hashtag eating crow. So I'm cool
There you
with
go.
that. But I
Good.
remember
You
those
own
are
the
the two
L's. You got to
moments.
own your L's. Own
Oh
your
no,
L's.
like I'm not, sometimes, maybe there are times when you're going to be like doubling down, but there are
Yeah.
times you're like, I can't. Like you had a team that was perfect, but for whatever reason, they just could not put it together in the playoffs. And you guys came out, maybe you used this fuel. I don't know, but perhaps I did. And if I didn't do my team a disservice, who knows? But hey, it is what it is. But those are the two that stand out for me. Those are much
Who
easier than say the opposite, or the greatest moments, or
Yeah, yeah.
fondest memories. The ones that you the ones that you hold a
You
certain
remember
take,
those
you're like,
ones.
oh yeah, because people let you know. They let you
They
know.
definitely do. Who have been who are your broadcast idols?
Ooh, that's another good question. There's quite a few.
Hmm.
I have to say, and there's a lot. Brian Williams. My
Yes.
dreams have always been to host an Olympics and to also a World Cup of soccer, right? So 2022, fingers crossed. I'll be doing some Olympic coverage for our team, although it's going to be done here. It's not necessarily in Tokyo for obvious
Yep.
reasons.
Yep.
But being able to broadcast from Calgary, talking to our athletes, it'll be a really neat experience. So I'm excited for that, just
Absolutely.
get a taste of it, and then hopefully 2022 Beijing things will be easier, and then 2024 in Paris. So for their summer games,
But
so that'll
not
be cool.
2026 because that's another podcast.
Oh yeah.
That's another podcast.
Yeah, it's still a sore spot with people here. I remember that
Yeah.
plebiscite. Like I was still in
Yeah.
Saskatoon at the time. But
Yeah.
I'd say, getting the opportunity to do that, much like Brian Williams being a host. Scott Russell is another person.
Yeah.
A person like who's currently in the game that I really appreciate is Andy Petrillo. I
Oh,
think
nice
she's
pull.
done I think she's done a really good job, and you've seen the growth uh, throughout when she started with Hockey Night in Canada. Remember, she was doing those intermission breaks. Well, you
Mhm.
see her; she's at the Stampede, much like Ron McLean. She's doing a lot of that Stampede coverage. I think she's just very talented altogether, and she also helps out with CPL with One Soccer, and you just see the range that she has. I think that's kudos. Mike Tirico is another guy like that, except he's on the broadcasting field, which is tremendous because the guy can call golf, the guy can call football, the guy can call hockey. That guy called hockey for the first time. Was it last season or 2 seasons ago?
Yeah, and he was great.
Something like, yeah, and people were like, "Damn, I didn't realize how Tarico was good. The range that he had was
And
insane.
hockey's hard. I gotta
Oh,
say, as a play-by-play guy, like basketball's easy, baseball easy, hockey, football really hard.
I
Hockey
think yeah,
particularly.
I think because there's certain parts in those sports where you can allow the game to breathe,
Yes,
right? You can, but there's so much going on with hockey that it just
line shifts.
constantly you have to like be on guard and just kind of like make sure you get. And even sometimes seeing a play, like, you see a bad line change, well, you're seeing they're coming off slow in the change, and they,
Yeah,
just because they were half-assing, well, sorry to say that, but kind of
yeah,
doing that, kind of being in that position.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, they got caught on a change, and you're like, oh, this is brutal. You always have an analyst with you that provides that in, the spectrum from the player's perspective and all that stuff. But it's really, for sure, I think one of the most challenging sports to do. Like, you have to be on. And I remember doing it. I was doing it for fun. I've only done it so many times. Same thing with volleyball, but it was a good experience nevertheless. When I was at the University of Saskatchewan, just helped out, and it was okay. Nothing great. I think where my talents are, I have no problem covering it if I need to.
I feel like you would be a fantastic color commentator.
I remember doing it. I remember I was very fortunate because I think I was one of the when Lethbridge was hosting the national championships. The women were,
Yeah,
and this was the national championships 2006, and so I was a first year student, and I was the only first year student to actually get to call a game. I was very fortunate, so I was like, okay,
you don't always
so
get it.
yeah, and I was covering like, I think, a fifth place game. They're like, yeah, we'll give you the fifth place game, and I was like, I was cool
Sure.
with it. And sure enough, I think the Lethbridge Kodiaks got bounced out or something disappointing happened, so they ended up going to the loser bracket. And yeah, I remember covering it. I was like, it's crazy. And it's funny looking back because I looked so scared, wide-eyed and everything else. It was so funny, but I was like, kind of just analyzing and trying my best when it came to it. And I guess, getting back to it, trying it, I'm like, I got no problem. Even if I was doing the Olympics and they had me cover table tennis, I'm down.
It's
I think
good.
it'd be
It's
so
good to go.
cool to cover
Yeah.
something like that. Artistic gymnastics, 100%. Let's go.
Yes, let's go.
Whatever obscure sport. They even got even skateboarding, man. Like, I wasn't a skater guy, but hey, I think the point of being a play-by-play is that you're just giving it. You're not necessarily analyzing it all the time. You're just providing just more so what's transpiring. If you got a cool guy that you're working with, a cool color person that can and really provide that energy, and you can feed off each other. I think
Exactly.
that's one of the things. And there's so many people that are so good at that, where you're just like, I don't know if I can compete, because they're so good. But I'd say, like, hopefully getting a chance to do that, to cover an Olympics, would be my goal. Brian Williams, like I said, Andy Petrillo. Trying to think of anybody locally that we can see that he always had an appreciation. There are quite a few people actually out in Sportsnet and TSN that are really, really, really good at their craft. Like, I think Matthew Shinetti is another guy who's really, really good. I've always appreciated. Farhan Lalji is another guy who's been great. There's such a good number, but I would say I try to take a piece of what they do because I'm like, I like how they do things. Rod Smith is just a consummate pro.
Yeah.
Covers the CFL. So I was like, yeah, I like that. I like that vibe. Just he's got that voice where you're
He
like, all right,
does.
I'm listening. It's just grub, he's just ready to get there. And so I think there's like a little bit of elements that I see in all those people I just mentioned that I really like. I think they just, from going that broad range where they can cover not just a specific sport that's all they can do, but you can see them covering hockey or baseball or something like that. So that's something I kind of aspire to. But just being that host would be cool because you get that opportunity to kind of oversee things and be in front of the camera and joke around. And knowing myself, there might be a flub or two, but I always have fun with it.
That's the key, right?
Oh, I don't take myself seriously. I think that was one of the things I learned throughout my time is, nobody cares. Really.
Yeah.
Like, and if I'm really worried about that, it just means I'm vain. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like nobody really, everyone's got their own set of problems or worries or something like that. So I'm just like, you know what? If I screw up, you correct yourself, you move on, you go with it. People get it. It's not like they don't fumble or stumble every once in a while. And even then, they see you and they're like, it's human. And they don't think twice about it. Well, you might, or you may have said something they may have not caught on, but you're like, whatever. So you kind of learn to just like, it's like water off a duck's back.
Fandom. We've talked about this with a few broadcasters, especially on the sports side. Of where do you see yourself on a spectrum of fandom of being like a Bill Simmons, where you're going to hear about where you have the teams that you have, and you try to sneak them into, just on the other side of like who your teams are and you just kind of keep it to yourself, right? Because I think there's people that we interviewed Peter Klein. People think he's a Flames fan, he's a Canucks fan, but he doesn't really echo it, right? And being from Saskatchewan, I would imagine maybe you're a Riders fan, and I don't know. I think maybe Blue Jays, maybe Raptors. I'm not sure where your other fandom goes, but who are your teams, and then how do you kind of devolve with broadcasting and having those teams when you do?
It's a hodgepodge, man. I'm just all over the place.
Yeah.
So we'll start with hockey. It's the New York Rangers because of Mark Messier. My fondest memory was '94 and watching what he did. And
Why
you
not?
can't go wrong with.
Good
Hey,
times.
if someone's got the cojones to say, you know what, we're gonna win.
Yeah.
And when you're down 3-2 in the series, not only that, but you don't only say you win, but you perform. You got a hat trick. Like that puts you in like God status, right? Like legendary status. You know what I mean? In terms of the sports world. And then when it comes to baseball, I grew up an old Expo fan, so the Nationals. So for them winning 2 seasons
There you
ago,
go.
so huge. And it's sad they couldn't do it in La Belle Province, but at least they got it done. So there's ties in. But if I'll tell you this, if Montreal gets a team again, I'll be cheering for them.
I think they're
That's
going
how it
to. I
is.
think Montreal and Vegas in the next 2 years. It sounds like.
Well, you know what? The way Tampa is going, I don't know if they're going to expand. If that's the case, hey, cool. But if not, bring Tampa up. The only weird thing is I'm a National League guy, so it's going to be weird having the DH permanently. But I think that's what they've talked about regardless.
Yeah.
So there's that. Basketball, I was a Celtics fan. I actually liked, and it really comes down to a player that I kind of like followed and liked. So Rick Fox was a Canadian, obviously. So I was like, oh, and he was playing with when he came into the league. Of course, it was the kind of the end of the Celtics era, like the prominent era.
Reggie
So like
Lewis,
Larry Bird was
unfortunately.
retired. Yeah, he was on the verge of retiring. Kevin McHale was gone. Danny Ainge was on his last leg, that sort of thing. So it was kind of the end of that.
You get the
golden
Dana
era.
Burrows, D Brown, and then you have the unfortunate tragedy of Reggie Lewis.
Yeah, it was. Just kind of and just seeing how like that team evolved like through all the pain. And I always felt like, man, if you're with a team, you stick with them, even through the thick and thin. Now, of course, CFL, Saskatchewan, which I got a funny story in a second.
Sure.
Then I think we covered everything: basketball, baseball, football.
Just we read the writers just as a basketball fan. If people saw my little smirk, it's because I'm a Lakers fan. So.
Oh, are you? Oh, I was gonna say I hate you already. No, I'm just kidding. No, I came out. And you know what? It's funny because I'm on a podcast too, and I'm like, I'm not gonna deny my allegiance. I'm not going to deny my allegiance.
Good.
But I'm not
and I like that when people do that.
And I'm not stupid. Like I'm not going to be here. Like I will be partisan. I'm like, if my team is crap, I will say they're crap. Like I have no problem with it. Like when the Lakers won, I said LeBron would not be considered the greatest player unless he wins a championship with the Lakers. I didn't know if it was going to happen in his years. He did it in his second season. And I was like, you know what? I have to consider him now on par with Michael Jordan. A lot of people will find that controversial, but I would say nobody has ever taken 3 different teams to a final and win.
Yeah.
Just saying. And with LeBron's power, he did it. So I consider him, if anything, 1A.
I still got
Michael
him
Jordan's
third.
one.
I got Jordan Braun. I got Jordan Kareem and then Braun.
Okay. Well, you got nothing wrong with Kareem. You can't.
No.
Like, it's funny, and it's a great debate to have because there's no
it's so great. No,
there's no real right or wrong answer, right?
It'll all be answered with Space Jam.
Yeah. It's funny because I'm not really interested in watching this one. I don't know.
I think a lot of people are.
But what I do appreciate though with LeBron and what they did here was they're not, even though it's Space Jam 2, they're not taking the same.
It's going a different route.
Yeah, they kind of changed it up a little bit. It's so. And I'm a big fan of Don Cheadle. He's one of my favorite actors, so that's awesome. Anytime he's there, I'm down. So there's that. So, but going back to Saskatchewan, the funniest thing is like, I'm as an immigrant, of course, like you're always like kind of allegiances to teams and. So for, of course, like growing up in the prairies in Saskatchewan, they're the only pro sports team. I remember meeting a couple of them that came to my school when I was in, elementary when I was little. So, I had an affinity for the Riders, but this is around the 90s where they were they were god awful. I remember the telethon very well where the team needed, people donations to save the club. Like it was that bad, so dire. Yeah. And that was in 97. But I remember like things just weren't going well. And I remember my mom, man, that was so funny. And I still do this. And I remember doing this on air. And My mom, I don't know, she wasn't pleased, but I had a good laugh. I always joke around because she always says, and she would say with, obviously she's, with an accent, she'd be like, and my name, and she'd be like, it's Musia, is how you say it in translated. But she's like, Musia. It's like, why do you cheer for the Niners? They run, they always lose. And I just laughed, and it's still stuck with me because it's the funniest line. And I'm like, yeah, it's true. But I'm like, but mom, you still have to love them through thick and thin, bad or
Yeah.
good. And when it started like in the early 2000s, you started to see the turnaround, and a couple Grey Cups later, shoot, man, they won more Grey Cups in my lifetime than they did the previous years since their existence in the early 1900s, right? So you're thinking to yourself, like, dang, man, dang. So I was very fortunate because I was born around the time I was very little. I obviously don't have any recollection of '89. But I remember them going to the Grey Cup in '97 and losing. I remembered all those losing seasons. I remember them finally winning in 2007, which was awesome.
I was in Regina then. It was crazy.
Oh yeah, the parties. I saw
Yeah.
the. Oh man, I was watching some of the news. Oh my gosh, it's crazy. People just like jumping on the poles, and like I think one actually kissed one of the reporters.
Yeah.
It's just like people were just like so jubilant. I remember that. I was just like, for me, it was like relief. I'm like, holy crap, I'm actually alive to actually see them win. Because the joke about Saskatchewan, man, they can get to the finals, but they keep losing, man.
Yeah.
And my mom's voice was just still there in my head.
No running.
They keep running, they always lose. So I remember that. It was it was cool. And then they did it again in 2013. If I'm not mistaken, it was 2013. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
I know they went to a couple of Grey Cups in between. Those losses to the Alouettes were tough, but man, just having a team in the Grey Cup and cheering for them was so awesome. And I'll have that allegiance to Saskatchewan, no problem. But I'd have no problem with the Stampeders. I think it's about individuals and organizations. And I think Huff is also from Saskatchewan too. So there's a correlation there. So I'll have a love for that. But one of the things that I have to say is, I have my allegiance to teams, and I'm cool with that. Like, I have no problem if anybody does, but I'm not going to let that interfere. I'm not going to say they suck. And you're like, well, Bo Levi Mitchell just threw for 400 yards, 3 touchdowns, and ran for 1. So, and also beat the Riders in the process. So how does he suck? The dude balled out. I'm like, hey, I can't knock it. Like, if the dude's balling out, that secondary and that defense is not doing anything to stop him, you got to give the guy credit. You got to make sure. So for me, I was like, look, you have to, even if and I'm not, like I said, to LeBron, I'm not a big LeBron fan, but I'll admit, I think to me, he's the second greatest player to play in the NBA. I think he's almost close to Michael Jordan. Like, at this point, in terms of what he's done, when we look at it, I honestly think when we look at his career, the dude went to like 8 consecutive NBA finals.
9. And you and I actually saw Jordan play, which is so weird to this younger generation. Like, he was a wizard to me. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so old. That part always kind of just throws me off. Go ahead.
About how bad the team was. And you think of Kwame Brown in that era of like the Wizards. But in those 2 seasons, if Michael Jordan did not get hurt, they would have been a playoff team.
100%.
Guaranteed.
Yep. 100%.
Because you look at their record, they had one of the better defensive records, points per game was somewhere in the low 80s with Jordan in the lineup. Without him, that skyrocketed into the 90s. So you look at what the Jordan effect had on the Wizards in those 2 seasons, and when he was in the lineup, they were above 500.
They were better than people remember.
They were trash. So like I think there was an effect that Michael Jordan had when he was playing, even as an OG, even when he got older, didn't have necessarily the same hops. His brain was there, and he did drop 50 at one point.
And that block at Ron Mercer, that's one of my favorite blocks ever.
100%. When you look at that in that career, like the dude still had some game, and I think we do a disservice when we think of that time with the Wizards as terrible, because I'm like, well, when he was on the court, the team was actually pretty good. Yeah. And like you said, people forget about that. We just look at the end result of the record, but nobody looks at when he was in the lineup compared to when he got hurt. And when he was in there, they were a playoff team. And who knows, they could have knocked off a team. And with MJ, he provided a certain air about him.
He did.
Yeah. So I think that was one of the things. But yeah, you're right. Like, I remember that shot. Brian Russell, no chance. I thought what was really cool was the documentary that came out last year. I think that really kind of reignited the debate. And a lot of youngsters, you talk about some young kids that did not see Jordan play or remember him as a Wizard.
They started to understand.
they're like, holy crap, this dude was a beast, you know?
Yep.
And I thought that was neat. So it was a great doc that
You
came
get to
out.
see
And it,
Magic and Barkley and understand like the Chuck isn't just this fat funny dude on TNT that Chuck was a different level of
or
player.
Shaq,
Or
you
Shaq,
know,
yeah.
Michael Jordan originally was intimidated by watching Shaquille O'Neal.
Mhm.
And then they got to go, and then he watched him play, and he's like, all right, I got him. You know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Yeah, because
But
that's
you
what MJ
see,
does.
yeah, but you saw like when you first see like how intimidating Shaq was, it's crazy. Like even watching some of the old documentaries with Shaquille O'Neal when he was younger, and this is like pre-Laker days, maybe his first year with their 2 years at the Lakers was different. But you know, we obviously know like he'd have fun. Like his off season was his off season, and then he got in shape when the season started, right? Like he was getting in shape
Yeah.
as the season progressed.
Oh, because he
That was
told
Shaq.
Dr. Buss, I'll go to shape in company time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. But he's like, my summer is my summer. And I know that kind of that irked Kobe a lot because
Yeah,
Kobe
they
was
did.
just a machine, right? So
Yep.
that they're both alpha males, but both had different ways of dealing with things and they clashed. But the respect with those two was phenomenal as they got older and realized they're like, man, we could have had something even more special if we put our egos aside. But anyways, Shaquille O'Neal, when he was younger, do you see how built he was? He
Yeah.
was a little skinnier, but he was jacked. Think of like Zion Williamson and what he looked like in
But
high school
bigger,
or
yeah.
university or even at the like. Yeah, imagine that. Like him, it'd be Shaq against me. That's what everybody else in the NBA looked like at the start of the year.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm like, holy crap, what is this
Everyone
dude?
had
Like
that
this dude's
poster too in Orlando. Everyone had that
oh
poster.
yeah, like he was so incredibly intimidating
He
in
literally
his
was a
early yeah.
superhero to some.
Oh, 100%. And he did take Orlando to the finals. You could imagine if it was them and the Bulls, if Michael Jordan didn't retire, how crazy that series
Nick
would be.
Anderson didn't lose it up here.
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Nick Anderson did a lot of things to infuriate. Well,
Yeah.
same thing with BJ Armstrong. He did that when
Yeah.
he was with Charlotte. And
Yeah.
you hear in the stories too. But no, it was great. So I don't know. It's just like one of those things where I'm always a person like, look, if you ball out, if you do whatever, you're going to get the credit. Like there's no ands, ifs, or buts. Even if you're a player that I'm not a big fan of, there's athletes. Their job is to tick people off, like Corey Perry, right?
Yeah.
But in a heartbeat, if he was on your team, you love him to death. Love him.
There's going to be a lot of
So,
teams this offseason that are going to want him now.
oh, 100%. He's not
Yeah.
quite Pat Maroonish, but he'll get you a cup final.
Last question again. Thanks for your time, Moses.
Hey, no worries, man.
You kind of hinted a little bit just the future of like some of your final aspirations, and it sounds like Olympics and being a part of a year World Cup, and you're going to have that opportunity hopefully in 2026 in Alberta, at least in the Edmonton side, hopefully Calgary. Is those kind of the two main goals, or what else do you have for the aspirations for the future here?
I think those are it. I think like for me, I've always dreamed like there's something about it when I was a kid, just watching the Olympics. My
Mhm.
fondest memories, like when I started like fondest sports memories growing up, I can remember to this day, 92 Barcelona, 94 Lillehammer. I remember watching those very closely. I remember watching Peter Forsberg. I remember watching
Yep.
Paul Correa. I remember watching that gold medal final. I remembered watching Mark Tewksbury winning gold for Canada in swimming. Like I remember the dude just losing his mind when he found out that he won. And I was like, those are imprinted. I remember watching the Dream Team when they were destroying everybody by like 40 points or more. It's just absolutely insane how like my fondest memories or most like impressionable ones involve the Olympics and the other ones were the World Cup because I guess the events were, every 4 years. So you had 3 years of buildup to that event in between. So for me, I'm always looking at that as, I'm like, oh, you're remembering the times. I remembered when France, the defending champions, played in 2002 in the games in Japan and Korea and World Cup, and Zinedine Zidane, David Trezeguet, Thierry Henry, like the dudes were balling. Like they won the cup 4 years ago. They won the Euros in 2000, right? Like you still had that main core of the team involved. And I remember they ended up losing their first match to Senegal, you know, and I was like, how cool is that? And those are like, there's certain memories that are so impressionable and they stuck with me. And I saw how globally people were tuned in and how I was drawn into that. And that's something that I've always wanted to be part of. So I got to experience that obviously as a fan, as a person watching it on TV, but to be actually be part of a broadcast, to be part of an event. Like I was, I got to catch a couple of games when the Women's World Cup was here. Was it 2015?
Yeah, I was up at in Commonwealth for the final, well, the semi with England and Japan.
Yeah.
I was up
So
there
I
for
got to
that.
go.
Good game.
Oh yeah. So I was in Alberta at the time and ended up driving up to go watch a couple of the games out as well. And I ended up seeing like the Americans who ended up winning it all. And
Fun team to watch.
oh, they were crazy. Yeah, they were so good. Oh my god. But you look at that, and there's also players on that team that you love to hate. Like even Wambach was a player you love to hate. Especially as a Canadian. There's certain members of that team where you're just like, oh, they irk you so much, and that also goes on to the whole 2012 semifinal with Canada and the US.
Yeah,
the drama there. But kind of circling back and just kind of talking about like to answer your question, it's just there's something about being part of something, a global event, that is just so remarkable and so much fun and so captivating as a viewer, and as being able to like, hey, talk about certain events. Like I remember like saying, hey, we had a couple Olympians come back home after winning a gold and talking to them. That was so cool. But to actually be involved in a production, getting a chance to be there, that's something that I've always had aspirations for, and those are kind of my end goals at the moment. And if I got to do that and came back and here got to chill out in Calgary and live my life here and covering sports here, you know what, I'm set. But if I get the opportunities to go out and cover an international event, to go out and cover, whether it be soccer, whether it be the World Cup, or the Olympics, that to me is my life, like my end goal. And being able to do multiples would be great, but to cover at least one on each side would be fun.
Well, Moses, thank you so much for your time. You're an absolute brilliant broadcaster. It's been a privilege to have you on the pod today and to watch you do what you do on Global, and hear you sometimes on Mark Stevens' radio show at times as well. Be a guest on there. You have that at least in one thing in common right now. We've both had stopped on Mark's podcast. But again, it's an absolute privilege to have you. And